Anne is a professor at University of Sussex, as well as a professor of interaction design, social change and sustainability here at Malmö University. A warm welcome to Anne.
So has that, yeah, you can hear me with this, can't you? Okay, thank you. I'm hoping that I'm talking about sort of, I could do the now for something completely different, but we'll see. Um, right, things to manage. Does that one work? Yes, excellent. So I'm bringing this very much in the context of being a design researcher and somebody concerned with the developing converging crises that we find ourselves surrounded by. And rather than look for sort of what we would call sticking plaster solutions, my interest has become how do we really rethink culture and what has to happen to design and perhaps as its partner, social innovation, if we go for things which are really big in scope and we really rethink the values and the sort of ethos with which we live. So that kind of puts me in context that I'm actually, my mission at the moment has not been so much to make designs, but to really rethink how design works within societies, what we can contribute, and how we might manage to make that perhaps less materially focused, more immaterially focused. So if I could ask you to hold that as a thought for what I'm going to be talking about. I'll just run through a few introductory slides and then give you a couple of case studies from some work that I've been doing where we were really looking at how the arts can stimulate a different way of thinking about the world from perhaps quite an effective sort of emotional perspective. So this is another kind of bold statement, shall we say. A lot of the work that I'm aligned with frames itself in terms of sustainability. I'm been proposing something which we've called it sort of eco-social futures, livable futures, which actually focuses perhaps more on what we want to replace, given that we're at a juncture where a lot of things are changing already. So I've been proposing that actually there are things that we don't want to sustain and asking these questions. Do we use our creative energy in fulfilling ways? Are we able to rest, play, and seek spiritual connection as we please? Are we able to support others as we would like? And if the answer to that is not a resounding yes, then we're already thinking about how things could be better. And so I'll invite you to go on that journey with me and the artists. And I also want to talk a little bit about what I mean by eco-social, because for a lot of designers, the social and the ecological are very tightly bound together. We can't effect complete change just by changing the environment. We need to be actually engaging people in the process of changing that environment. And yet, if we don't consider things like ecological justice and so on, we won't take people along. Conversely, if we need to be doing those changes, not just increasing social sustainability, but through that actually mobilizing people to think more about how we might live in relation to other species and broaden our concerns from this. If I say mere social, it is not to belittle the enormous amount of work that we need to do to dwell together well, but really that if we don't start to consider ourselves as very interdependent with other species, which I know is a challenge further, then we run the risk of losing some of the very vital parts of our world, both that give us joy, but also that give us sustenance. So that is the context, again, of what I'm speaking in. So I want to introduce you to the Creatures Project. It actually was originally called the Creative Practice for Transformative Futures, but it elided so beautifully into Creatures that is what it became known as over the 3 years. It was a big EU project with partners in 5 countries in Europe, and that was the academic partners, and then we also had 11 kind of distributed partners of other kinds, with creatives, with a couple of policy-related NGOs, and we produced far more material than we'd anticipated, not least because we launched in the middle of a pandemic, just as things were starting to kick off for us, all the shutters started to come down on arts practice, and people were told that they couldn't gather. Arts were told that if they wanted practice, it had to go online. So the transformations we were anticipating were very different from the ones that we actually encountered. But I want to talk a little bit about a couple of projects and just also what we were trying to do. So we were working in partnership by observing arts practice that was already in the process of trying to change societies in ways that the particular artists felt were important. So we didn't come in with a priori definition of what transformation should be. We very much worked to find out what our partners were interested by. That in itself became a research finding. And then how were they actually making that transformation? And we were intending to find out much more about how it landed, but that was another thing that the pandemic really cut, because we had access to our partners, but we had far less access to the audiences than we'd anticipated, or participants as we might see it. But they were concerned with aesthetic and ontological questions that often don't get sort of brought to the fore when we're talking about transformation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we work with imagination, reflection and connection, and looking at how we create cultural change. And one of the important things here is that they were mostly trying to go towards something better in the same spirit that I was talking about earlier, rather than deal with particular types of crisis or operate within a particular silo or sort of subject area. Really important here, so it's got its own slide. It was very much a co-created project. We devised it with some partners from the arts, and then we worked directly with them to make sense of the findings we were finding, and we all collaborated together. So that's important to note. And the other thing which I just want to give as a starting flavour is this sort of idea. In the end, we were trying to work out what the ethos of the project had been. How was it that we ended up with this collaboration with the artists, with researchers across different countries, mostly mediated by a lot of Zoom calls, far more than we actually met. And there became a sort of feeling about the world that we wanted to create. So this is what we defined it was as creaturely, because we were very stuck for vocabulary that speaks outside the way that we normally talk about changes in values. And creaturely ways of being and doing involve a gentler, connected approach, where the artificial lines between humans and nature are no longer drawn. It's a term to describe the changed orientation that creatures' transformations would lead to. Being creaturely is to be alive to possibility. The other thing to say about it is it's not a state. We picked a word that's actually an adverb. It's a way of doing something. So this is another point. It was very much about how do we move together towards uncertain futures. And as I mentioned, we had lots of arts practice as our sort of field of study. We ended up making what we called experimental productions. We made 20 of these. And I'm going to just introduce how we kind of assessed what we were learning and then turn to consider a couple of them in more depth. So our outcome was what we called the Creatures Framework, which was a way of thinking about what arts practice actually contributes in terms of how we understand what we can, in the sort of ways that we can influence people and groups. And we then sort of provided some material. So I'll just show you, we had these different ways of categorizing. We have embodying, learning, imagining, caring, organizing, involving, co-creating, empowering, and subverting as ways of thinking about how the quality of a transformation might manifest. And we particularly thought about that in terms of how it impacted meanings, connections, and power, which seem pretty kind of, what should we say, essential categories for how transformation might be approached. And then we go under the hood a little bit to explain what we mean. So here we would be embodying, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in practice in a minute. And here just sort of kind of a way of helping people on the ground do their evaluation. So a lot of arts organisations find themselves being asked to account for sort of the carbon they're saving. And they're sort of struggling because it certainly the players we were working with. They were working in excuse me, in regimes where nobody wanted to tell artists what to do, because that's kind of a big no-no. Artists are free to interpret their work in the way that they choose. But it did mean it was very difficult for the ones that we were working with, who were very purposeful in what they were trying to do, to kind of manifest the ways that they were actually trying to impact society. And it was very much about kind of like hearts and minds changed, and that might result in carbon saved, but you know, they were aiming for something different, and it wasn't about their own carbon impact. So this is very much an aid for a way of thinking about what kind of transformation is being made. How do we approach that creatively? How do evaluators approach it creatively? And why we would bother to do it differently. So I'm just giving you a little bit of a flavour here, because if this resonates at all, do have a look and do give us feedback, because we'd be really interested to know whether it works in contexts that are perhaps more general or in slightly different worlds. But to go back to the productions, I would like to just give you a little bit of a flavour of a couple, and sort of aligning with the idea of health, social care, innovations in that space. This is a particular one that was being run during the pandemic, and the advantage this one had was that we found that we could transfer it into an online space very easily, and it actually was enhanced by being moved into the online space. So let me give you a little bit of a flavour. So it's specifically designed by a former debt activist and artist called Cassie Thornton, to look at healthcare systems and try and provide something that was centred in the individual, but able to access different resources from the ones that one normally has access to, partly to provide in contexts where perhaps care isn't free and isn't easily available, partly to provide something which she saw as a kind of anti-capitalist measure which enabled you to manage your own care. It was based on the triangles that were appearing when the Greek financial crisis hit, and there was a social worker, a medic, and somebody representing mental health brought together to deal with sort of local crisis in access to healthcare, and increasingly as the refugee situation grew in that area, to support people coming in and help them adjust to life there. But Cassie took it as an art project and then created something which has now gone viral, and I think there are over 10,000 triangles operating now, and there are all kinds of people sort of spreading around to see how it could work. And the idea is, as you as the hologram invite 3 other people, they may be friends, acquaintances, people that you've been introduced to by other people for the very purpose. And you have one person who looks after your emotional health, one person who's looking after your physical health, and one person who's looking after your social health. And you might meet once every 6 weeks or 3 months, or you might just call somebody, call them up when you need it. And the idea is that it's a structure for talking through something that's bothering you in a fully rounded sense of how you could function as a person, and it's all done through questioning, and there's a sort of ritualized approach to how it works. And then your commitment as a hologram is not to reciprocate with your triangle, but to ensure that your triangle can have its own triangle, and so it spreads outwards and outwards and outwards. And it was actually based on the way that she's developed it was based on a kind of the trees that the Black Panthers were using to support each other with acupuncture and other things like this. So it's got some really interesting antecedents, but she really has sort of worked through to create a very small, tight little structure that pretty much anyone can use. And as she says, at its broadest and most ambitious scale, the hologram is intended as an open source, peer-to-peer, viral social technology for dehabituating humans from capitalism. And what was interesting for us is that originally it had been conceived that you would do it in a room, and it works brilliantly online. So a lot of what I'm talking about actually came from being on one of the courses that Cassie and then more and more of her colleagues and co-workers were running as a way of introducing the idea and bringing people in to start up their own holograms, and increasingly to train people to help other people start up holograms. And this is just a lovely little moment from one of the courses where they invited us all to put our thumb over the camera. And this was sort of a sense of togetherness that came across, very different worlds. We'd got people on really different time zones participating, and this was sort of how they were very aware of the kind of care needs even in setting the whole thing up. So I really enjoyed it, and I still have a hologram, and I'm a triangle on someone else's. So what has come out of this arts project? Well, it's unusual because quite often, art is, it just manifests as some kind of exhibition or something. But obviously this is much more socially engaged than that. And it's now operates in Spanish. There are courses being led by Spanish practitioners to encourage it to transfer across areas there. It has a structure which is being modified. There's a group of practitioners who meet regularly, some online, some in Berlin, where Cassie's now based, and they're sort of developing the practice. It's social care from peers, relying on a different form of capital, because actually if you don't have friends, you don't have people you can trust easily, it's more difficult to get into the process. And so one of the things that the group that's grown up round it is working on is how do you get yourself a triangle if you don't have social capital as one of your resources? And that's something they're very motivated to consider because they want it to be an inclusive process. So I'm presenting it as a it's partly a thought experiment, it's partly something that's going on. It is a form of social innovation. I'm interested in the design of it. But I just wanted to sort of present it as something which is going on as a way for us to think about how we create something very other within the societies we have. How do we produce something which actually challenges the structures we have? So that was one example. I think I still have some time to offer you another one. So this is the Treaty of Finsbury Park. This was run by Furtherfield, and this was absolutely clobbered by the pandemic because it was supposed to be taking place in a London park, and people were going to be able to represent different species who all have to coexist in the park, and many of whom were being, should we say, they're not considered in the future of the park. Where a lot of tensions because there need to be management strategies for the park. There are festivals held there by humans. So the art group decided, well, what would it be like if a festival was held by different kinds of animal and plant? And so there are, here you can see a goose, a tree, a stag beetle, a bee, a squirrel, grass, and a dog, all as sort of other kinds of stakeholder for the park. And it wasn't done naively in the sense that anyone really felt that they were going to come out knowing more about a dog's life or how it is to be grass. I actually did have to role play grass as part of being a researcher. And it was really fascinating because I did come out learning more about grass just through the experience of trying to be grass. But obviously I didn't feel that I had totally entered the many complexities of being grass. So I'll just put that out there. But what it does do is orientate people differently to the park and to the kinds of experience that they might have in the park and what flourishes there and how it could flourish. So again, it was designed very much from the point of view of trying to use alternative forms to get us thinking differently about our environment. This one did, as you can see, these graphics are from the online version, which was built in a hurry when the pandemic struck, because it wasn't intended to be played in that way. And it was quite interesting particularly listening to geese talking to grass, because that really is Dinner and Dinah having a conversation. And people were role-playing, but with a certain, as you can hear, there was plenty of potential for humour within this. And then eventually, just this year, we did actually get out into park itself and start to try out what it was like to enact these different groups, and the dogs all got together and they didn't know whether they could rub up against each other because they're humans playing dogs, and there are all sorts of complex things that came out which weren't anticipated but were rather fun. And so that manifested as, what should we say, various afternoons of play. We were lucky with the weather on the whole. And what it did do is give people a very interesting, getting accounts from it where we were able to sort of hear the sort of phenomenology of playing a different species. So, the stag beetles found the big expanses of the park very threatening. The dogs sort of went off at a completely different speed, and the trees got really angry. I mean, considering how mellow trees sort of seem, these trees got really frustrated at the speed they were supposed to move at. So lots of really interesting sort of temporal and phenomenological things appeared. And, there were lots of other activities like making costumes and things that were designed to sort of build up the role play. So what it did do, just, in spite of us all having a bit of a laugh, really, was take some of the eco-social issues that I've been raising and present them in a form where people didn't have to get too serious about them, they didn't have to argue about them, but it raised political issues like, which species get included in discussions around, sort of sustainability, and how they're related to the vulnerability of some of the smaller creatures, which just, and the idea that, as long as we have some stag beetles, it doesn't matter which. But of course, to individual stag beetles, maybe it does matter that they do or don't have a future. And the competition for food and all these other kinds of things which one might consider political issues. But also, taking the upper levels, like whose right to life, how we consider sentience in these types of contexts, and the sort of interrelationships and the interdependencies that we really need to focus on more as humans. So both of them were deliberately cultivating a kind of playfulness, a sort of embodied quality of viscerality, and an engagement with maybe some spiritual issues that often get marginalized. And in doing that, they do give us a chance to investigate the things that are perhaps round the corner or we haven't thought about, or thinking in different ways about our future. But also, I'm a big believer that if we don't enjoy the ride, what's the point of the ride? So it's not just that we need to prepare for uncertain futures, we need to enjoy going towards them. So what does that look like? And they welcome much more of the body into these kinds of discussion. So I've been trying to make sense of all this. One of the ways I've been thinking about it is in terms of intimacy, not the intimacy of sort of established couples or something like that, but the moments when you suddenly look at somebody else and realize you're both thinking the same absurd thought, or something has just connected and changed your sense of how you're orientated towards other people or your world around you. And those kinds of things, I think, can be really powerful and may actually be the things that really matter when we're trying to get people engaged in protecting worlds, in thinking about futures together, in going hopefully somewhere rather than just fearfully somewhere. So that's one thing. And then I've also been sort of feeling my way towards something where we have a lot of prefigurative work, and social innovation can be sometimes creating those spaces where we're, creating a new economic system that's running alongside the other one, or we're modeling something that could exist, just to see how it feels to actually run a different organization. But what does it mean to give people an experience of a feeling that doesn't exist but we want to exist, or that we can't access and we want to access? And so I'm really interested in the way that this work does something which I've been calling affective prefiguration, as the means of being able to share something that could exist and doesn't on that kind of emotional, affective dimension. So those are the sort of idea of participative intimacy and affective prefiguration, because big words, it's what academics do, isn't it? just as ways of trying to unpick something that's particular about this kind of arts practice, beyond the embodying and the inspiring. It's like, what are these sort of micro moments, and how is it making a difference? And so I think I'm moving towards sort of wrapping up with a few of the things that I've been pulling together from this work. And one of the things that I feel is that as we are moving towards uncertain futures together, which we are doing all the time, but suddenly we're focusing on the uncertain more than the futures, which may be healthy, but it's also more scary. One of the things I've been trying to work out is, well, what are these worlds that we're moving towards, and how are these arts practices helping us constitute them? So these are kind of, I suppose, maybe a mission statement for my direction of travel, that we have enough effort involved to form the basis of social bonds, enough transparency to show who to trust and in what circumstances, enough autonomy that decisions can respond to local conditions, enough discretion that kindness and care can complement fairness, enough charm that people want to engage, enough care that sharing seems worth the risk, enough intimacy to enhance the experience, enough openness for critique, response and change, enough inclusion that future generations and all life do well, and enough design, this is where I come in, for effective prefiguration. So yes, we're busy transforming design. It needs to travel from something which is very oriented towards the material to something which responds to the immaterial. And then we're working with these artists, the kinds of questions we can ask is, can design be about a different ethics? Can it be about different sources of meaning and ways of being, and ways of thinking about futures and different cultural imperatives and different rituals and practices and different relational tools, rather than just making more stuff or making stuff greener, which, if you do the math, doesn't really add up to cutting the way that we need to cut. So I leave you with these thoughts, just modest proposals that address the locality and acknowledge and build and share intimacies, that planet-centric approaches that stress eco-social benefits for life during the longer term of environmental change, so life after life after life, and playful encounters that encourage a feeling that things could be different, and how. Thank you. These are partners. This is the statement I have to make from the EU. And this is my details.
Thank you very much, Anne. It was a pleasure to